Welcome back to Worldbuilding Films, where we analyze the world settings and rules of films and TV shows to see if they work, if they don't, and if not, how they could be improved to enhance their stories. And today, we're talking about none other than the sci-fi action classic Minority Report, based on a short story by Philip K. Dick and directed by none other than Steven Spielberg, the Holy Emperor of cinema himself. And I mean it. He's my absolute favorite director and, frankly, personal idol of all time. And this is one of the many examples of why. A thrilling high-concept story about a crime unit that has the ability to actually predict murders in the future before they happen, and explores all its various ethical dilemmas. But of course, said dilemmas can only occur thanks to a very specific future that the film is set in. One that is surprisingly well thought out and ahead of its time, but that I think could be further expanded upon. So, that's what we're going to do here today as we review if the world building of this story works or not. To be clear, we will be reviewing the film mainly as it is, although we will also reference at times the original short story that it's based on. However, just so you know, I won't be considering the Minority Report TV show. Yes, that's a thing. Mainly because it has a lot of plot holes and contradictions, only lasted for one season, barely anyone knows this existed, and yeah, it just wasn't that good anyway. So, sorry, but I will be ignoring this one. Anyway, needless to say, we will be getting into some heavy spoilers here, so if you haven't seen this sci-fi classic, I highly recommend that you do first. And also guys, before we start, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Follow me on my Instagram page and join my Discord server, all linked below. Trust me, I predict that you'll have a good time. Alright, enough chit chat, let's get right to it. This is the world building review of Steven Spielberg's Minority Report. Nitpicks. So, I should start off by saying that I actually have to be careful here. The reason being that this film came out all the way back in 2002. And so, while this is set in the future, I should cut it some slack on some small details that just don't make sense anymore. For example, the fact that it uses these glass things as overly bulky flash drives. It's a product of its time and not a fault of the film, so I won't judge it for that. Plus, frankly, it ended up being one of the things that inspired the technology that we have nowadays, such as touchscreens, way before they were thought of. So, I won't nitpick things like that out of fairness. But there are a couple of things that I would like to slightly tweak just to get them out of the way. For example, while it is super cool that cars now are magnetically tied to roads and can even drive upwards, I would have all the roads curve a bit more slightly and not have them suddenly drop, because despite the fact that it does make a cool sudden moment, the sudden shift would realistically cause great discomfort to the passengers. Then there's the issue of the symbol of precrime in the tub in which the precogs are in. Cause if precrime is trying to keep their real identity and conditions a secret, as the film itself explains,
the precogs get over 8 million pieces of mail every year.
Each precog has their own bedroom, television, and weight room. It really is wonderful to be a precog.
This is a dead giveaway. So, I think the reason precrime would still choose such an obvious symbol could be because they could have lied and told the public that the precogs were actually born due to radiation experiments gone wrong or whatever, as the original short story implied anyway, and just so happened to give them their gift. Hence why they don't come out into the public very much, and even then they should have actors in place to fake the roles to the public, and just lie and say that it's for the protection of everyone because they're radioactive or something. And thus the symbol could be spun as a reference to the radiation symbol, something that's just barely under everyone's noses without giving away the full truth. Oh, and not to mention that if the precogs are seen as religious figures,
I find it interesting that some people have begun to deify the precogs.
I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes the symbol of a new church too or something. And finally, precrime chose to use small wooden balls for the names of victims and perpetrators because they can scan the minute fine grain of the wood to ensure that it can't be falsified.
Each piece is unique, the shape and grain is unique. The shape and grain is impossible to forge.
Fine, but if that's the case, just like with the precogs, then they should never be touched for any reason, much less thrown around. Yeah, look, I know. Like I said, these are just nitpicks, and I wanted to get them out of the way, and we're done. Now on to the important stuff, such as adaptation. Okay, since this is a very complex story and it has a very specific origin, I think it's important that we lay the groundwork and explain the differences between the book and the film. Because the two really differ a lot here, and I think that if we want to adjust the world building of the film, it would be best to pick and choose the best parts of both versions. So, let's take a look at them individually. First off, the film. While it's set specifically in the year 2054, a whole series of events happened before then. Up until this point, crime was starting to become rampant across the country, and I would imagine also in the rest of the world, and at the same time, a new kind of drug called heroin was being developed and distributed everywhere. People were getting highly hooked on this, and it was starting to cause some unintended side effects. Children that were conceived and born from addict parents showed immediate signs of brain damage. It was so severe that most didn't survive beyond the age of 10 or 12. The few who did survive, however, started to experience strange things. Mostly nightmares of horrific events, which, people later found out, were actually visions of murders that were really about to happen in the future. When this was discovered, Dr. Hyman and Lamar Burgess decided to use these children to stop murders before they happened, with the two splitting apart due to their differing moral opinions on the minority reports themselves. But you should know that by now. After which, precrime was created, mostly as an experiment within a 200-mile radius of Washington, D.C., and if proved successful, they would go nationwide. It took them about 5 to 6 years to gain the reputation that they had, making the area free of murder, and causing these now grown-up special kids, redubbed as precogs, to gain this status as almost divine figures that were about to change the world. To the point that, as mentioned before, their true identities and lifestyles were kept a secret from the public eye, with everyone thinking that they're being well cared of and living up a lavish life. And instead, they're being constantly sedated in this secret tub to be used as mere tools for the rest of their lives, and considered as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the world.
It's better if you don't think of them as human.
From there, the events of the film unfold as we already saw. With John Anderton having lost his son mere months before precrime, Agatha managing to show Anderton the vision of Anne Lively, him being shown a murder he will commit for someone he doesn't even know, the discovery of the minority reports showing that precrime is actually fallible, all the way to the end where Lamar is discovered having cheated precrime into existence, being exposed, and causing the downfall of the whole system. All well and good, but that's just on the movie side. 'Cause, believe it or not, the original short story by Philip K. Dick has a lot more lore behind the scenes. While not specified, it's also set sometime in the distant future. And to be clear, since this was written in the 50s, Dick's version of the future, "Welcome to the world of tomorrow,"
Why do you always have to say it that way?
is just as wild and sci-fi-y as you might think, to the point that here, humanity has started colonizing other planets even. Woof! Big difference just in that right there. Although, keep in mind, being written in the 50s, this also has a lot of really outdated concepts. Like freaking payphones, and needing to put a quarter in just to be able to listen to a radio. So, yeah, look, it's a product of its time, and I'll just ignore little details like that. Anyway, in this timeline, at some point there has been something called the Anglo-Chinese War, which has caused plenty of destruction and most farmlands have been bombed or destroyed in some manner. This has caused plenty of radiation to leak on Earth, which led to some mutations in people, including, yes, the precogs, who started having visions and were the thing that created the precrime division, which in the book didn't exist for just 6 years, but something like 30. To the point that most people now, especially the youth, never even saw someone die in their whole life. Woof! Talk about a new status quo. Also, the precogs aren't just described as being regular humans who just happen to have visions, but straight up deformed creatures born out of this radiation and who have to be constantly hooked up to these machines. Hell, aside from even the fact that the names are different, The female precog, called Donna in this case, is said to be 45 and yet looks like a deformed 10-year-old. Oof. Yeah, I gotta point something out. Sorry, Mr. Spielberg.
Please forgive me for the heresy I'm about to say!
But at this point, maybe you could have afforded to give the actors playing the precogs, like, some kind of deformity due to their mutation instead of just leaving them as pretty actors, even if it's something small that you can hide under a hat.
Okay, that's it! I'm gonna give you such a thrashing! Jeez Louise, cool.
Anyway, small aesthetic and world building details aside, there is one very big element and detail that I have to point out. In the book, it turns out that humanity actually isn't using electricity anymore because appliances are described as being atronic appliances, and electricity is seen as something far gone and almost incredibly outdated that you find only on the most distant colonized planets. So, what? They have this new energy source called Atron? Do we get any explanation for that? Well, no. It just says that they have it, and that's it. No other explanation. Which is very frustrating, as a whole new kind of energy source that doesn't rely on electricity, and in fact makes it seem like an outdated thing, is a huge deal. No wonder then that these fools are conquering other planets. Ugh. Alright, well, since the book didn't clarify anything itself, I'm just gonna throw my own hat in the ring. Even if we don't know what this energy source technically is, I'm just going to assume that this is what caused this supposed Anglo-Chinese war. Perhaps the radiation and fallout that came after, and that created this book's version of the precogs. So, minus other details aside, these are the main differences between the book and the film. And honestly, it's this last detail, this supposed Atron, that has me hooked. Because it can help explain a whole bunch of details going forward with reviewing the world building of Minority Report. However, we'll get into more details with that later on in this series. For now we'll stop here, as next time we'll be discussing another aspect that mostly belongs to the film. And that is the sheer level of surveillance that this world has. So stay tuned, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Join my Patreon if you want to support what I do here, and I'll see you all at the next video. See you then, and as always, keep building worlds! Hypersurveillance. So, having discussed both the book and the film, it's time we focused on the Spielberg adaptation. Because, for all the brilliant concepts and ideas that the original Philip K. Dick story has to offer, the film toys with an extra layer of complexity. And that is, the amount and ethics of mass surveillance in this world. Cause, let's be real, the amount shown in the film is bonkers. So, let's go back to the basics. This is a future where everyone is constantly monitored at every turn. You got general eye scans to enter and exit any place. In fact, small side note, they're so good that they can scan you even if your eyes are closed. 3D holographic videos that target ads specifically at you as an individual person.
John Anderson, you can use a Guinness right about now.
There are technologies that can literally scan your brain for not only the precogs, but even for the general public, to the point that they willingly go to VR pods to experience their deepest dreams. Although, knowing the internet today, I'd say we would have seen way weirder stuff in there. They got spider bots to legally enter your homes and check on people, and just... yeah, it's a lot. In fact, it's kind of too much. Which, however, at the end of the day, is the point. In fact, small side note, the film could have even played with the idea of tricking the population into thinking some areas are safe, when instead they're not. For example, people could think that the magnetic cars are safe from surveillance, but it's actually just a facade into reassuring people. Because otherwise, why would they choose to have what are essentially these mini private buses, regardless if they're private or not, when they have subways as well? And you might think it's because it gives them a sense of control to drive. But no, cause regular cars are still a real thing if they want that. So it could be very ironic if these things were just another trick for the general populace. A trick that maybe Anderton would have tried to sabotage from the inside though when he escaped precrime. But whatever. Anyway, at the same time, there are a lot of hiccups in this whole mass surveillance system, believe it or not. For example, despite it being everywhere, if you think about it, Anderton's location wasn't picked up when his eyes were being scanned for the holographic ads in the mall. He was targeted only as he exited the subway. This implies that certain scans don't actually sell you out, and they're specifically the ones for the ads. Geez, this really is impossible sci-fi, huh? And you might think I'm just being cheeky, but really think this through. The movie is a critique on mass surveillance, and if that's your point, you should go all in. Yet, at times, they hold back like in this occasion. And it's not just a petty criminal, but an actual cop from the inside who has been forced to go rogue, and who has enough information to actually make the entire system collapse. This is freaking pre-crime, man! So how come they didn't just shoot this as a high-level priority to the federal government or something, so they could have access even to the ads? And no, we can't even use Whitwer's line in the film.
In the meantime, I'm betting he's somewhere in the sprawl. Anderson's smart enough to go where electronic billboards and other media can't ID him to pick his pockets. There's fewer consumers there, which means fewer scanners to target him.
Because we clearly see that he's still going places and is being scanned. And a mall doesn't exactly sound like a barrack to me. So, which is it? Is it a critique of mass surveillance everywhere or not? Cause this right here is quite a hole in your message, especially when we're shown people are so desperate that they have to remove or replace their own eyes just to have privacy. Unless there's actually something more complex happening behind the scenes. Do you remember how in the previous part I mentioned that in the original story by Philip K. Dick, humans aren't even using electricity anymore, but are actually using some kind of energy called atron that is powering all their appliances? Well, like I said there too, it doesn't clarify anything beyond that. It's just this new undefined kind of energy source. So, since this is such a clean slate, what if we were to actually take advantage of that and insert it into the lore of the film? I propose that several years prior to 2054, humanity has indeed achieved some kind of new alternate energy source. More specifically, it's a type of energy that can give way more power than electricity. How it does so doesn't matter for our case. It's sci-fi, we can just say that they created a new kind of element or something like that. In fact, I'd argue that it's so powerful that it's starting to replace the energy needed for other kinds of tools in this world. For example, the thrusters of the flying suits used by the pre-crime officers. Because we see that they're like jetpacks, which is always cool to see, don't get me wrong, but let's face it, these guys would be burning their asses on a daily basis, and using regular fuel like that would be super expensive. I can understand for like huge flying vehicles that can carry multiple cops, but this is quite the waste if it's just a regular gas, even if it is 2054. But if it's this new sci-fi-esque thing called atron, and it just creates far more energy with far less consumption, then maybe it will be able to give a powerful thrust with ease and barely consume anything at all, and just fly in the air like Banshee from X-Men or something. The same can be applied for those incredibly awesome rotating shotguns that seem to blast sound waves, which are super cool, but would admittedly consume a lot of energy in order to achieve that, not to mention the sheer recoil they'd give. But if we said it was this undefined atron, then maybe it's a type of energy that can be converted to release a large pulse like this with barely any cost, and can also minimize the recoil. Yes, I get it. I'm treating this like it's basically magic. I know. But think about it. While I get that the film was shot in 2002 and could afford to be wild and speculative on what the future would look like, and again, I'm not trying to blame it for anything, we're weirdly enough getting pretty close to that date now, and in hindsight we're not seeing all the kind of sci-fi worlds that we were promised. So, in order for us to have such a visually distinct future, something big would have to happen. We need to introduce some kind of energy source that would completely uproot and change the world as we know it. So, this Atron, even if unexplained, might fit the bill. In fact, we can say that many wars were fought in the previous years just so every country in the world would have access to it, which in turn could have made governments tense and created this future of hyper-surveillance everywhere, and also caused a lot of stress for a lot of people. So much so, a great amount of the general populace would need some relief and have an extra reason to get hooked on heroin, which in turn was what eventually gave birth to the precogs in the first place. Plus, even the original story said that all of this started to happen after the so-called Anglo-Chinese War that nearly devastated the planet, so it would kind of fit. Now, having said all of that, there is still one main issue with this Atron. I've been explaining it as this incredible energy that can do it all, and has replaced all, or at least most, of human technology and appliances in order to work this well. Fair enough. But even the most sci-fi, magical, supernatural, or magical things in fiction always need some drawback or cost in order to feel truly believable. So, despite all its benefits, a limit would need to be applied here as well. I propose that when this Atron is quote-unquote activated, it does so by molding and adapting its full potential to the device it powers, almost learning it in a way to the best that it can be. Hell, maybe to the point that it almost gives the impression of a semi-sentience and is what powers the AI of precrime spider bots. But once it's done, it solidifies and becomes permanently like this and can't be changed afterwards. In a way, you can think of it like an energy equivalent of adamantium, flexible and adjustable while kept boiling, but when it cools down,
it's indestructible.
Which, come to think of it, might actually also explain why spider bots are a thing, but regular robots aren't around, cause those can be a threat if something goes wrong, but spider bots are more manageable. Either way, this means that all government, agencies, corporations, etc. would need to be very decisive and careful when planning this, because the only way to change it is to take it out and start completely from scratch. So, having said all of that, I will not claim that the entirety of the world of Minority Report has converted to Atron exclusively. That's quite a lot. However, we can say that they started to implement them in many places nonetheless, such as the before mentioned precrime jetpacks and sonic guns, and also part of the hyper-surveillance placed in the world. Why would I think this? Well, like I said earlier, when John Anderton was foretold that he would kill Leo Crow, and he went on the run, for all the mass surveillance that we see in Washington DC, the moment he enters the mall, the ads are targeting him, but not revealing his position to precrime. It's only after in the subway. Hell, in fact, when Anderton got Agatha and they were both in the mall, they were never caught with the eye scans. And okay, sure, fine, Anderton had replaced his eyes by this point, but not Agatha. And you're telling me that she, the single most precious entity in all of precrime, didn't have her eyes scanned and kept on file, and wouldn't be the top one priority to scan across the entire city, lest the whole system fails? And yet, they got away scot-free, even if it is also thanks to her powers, sure. That would make sense, unless when these scanners were originally put in place, since they would be powered by Atron, they were originally programmed to only show ads to customers and ensure their privacy. And since, as I said in this proposition of mine, Atron would cement itself like this, then even assuming that the government would change its mind and would start to cheat its way into spying everyone everywhere, which is very in tune with what we see nowadays, this system wouldn't budge anymore and it would be too expensive, time-consuming, and difficult to hit a hard reset, making places like the mall then ideal locations to remain hidden, even if temporarily, much to the frustration of precrime itself. Hell, need further proof that it would make sense if implemented like this? Well, we can find it in John Anderton's eyes. When it was foretold that he would kill Leo Crow, he got immediately flagged and all of precrime went on his ass. The only way he could cheat the system was by literally getting his eyes surgically replaced with someone else's so he won't be ID'd.
Hello, Mr. Yakamoto. How those assorted tank tops work out for you?
Mr. Yakamoto.
After that, he had to get back into precrime to get Agatha, the only one who had the key to clear his name, and to do so he had to gain access again by scanning the entrance with his old eyes, which he kept for himself.
And I have to replace them with new ones.
I know that, but I want to keep the old ones.
Even towards the end of the film, the only way Anderton was able to get free from prison and go to the gala that would expose Lamar and the entire precrime system in the first place was because his wife Lara broke him out by also using his eye, which she kept. Do you see the problem with this? If John Anderton was accused of future murder, why would precrime still keep his eye scans on record to the point that he'd have full access of the entire damn building, even after he's been caught and has murdered Leo Crow? Anderton would have never won at the end of the day and exposed precrime with the minority reports, because precrime should have wiped his ID from the records. And even if for some absurd reason the cops at precrime couldn't change it, how come they couldn't straight up call the US government and say this was a code red where they needed them to reset this information from the top level? This is a major plot hole, guys, especially from a movie that, up until this point, had been doing a pretty good job, all things considered. How come no one noticed this before, and how could the cops in precrime allow this? Well, we can still fix this, actually. Because if we say that in this world Atron is being used everywhere, perhaps it's also what's powering most, if not all, of precrime itself. A police force that needs to be at its maximum capability, to the point that even their vehicles and gadgets and more need to use it if they want to prove to the world that precrime is actually effective. But in exchange, this means that in order to use this Atron, they also had to abide by its limitation, and accept that once it's set up, they can't change or undo it anymore. Not even the federal government can change this flaw, or at least certainly not in time. It might bite them in the ass one day, but being cops, abiding by the law is what they're supposed to do anyway, no matter how personal it gets, so it's something that they would have to accept in order to prove this experiment right, especially someone as Machiavellian as Lamar. And look, I'm fine with the idea that resetting the entire system and getting rid of John's ID is possible, but it could take something like weeks or months to do, which precrime couldn't afford because they only had 48 hours before John committed his precrime murder. And thus, this would give him and his wife all the time they needed to still take advantage of his own eyes and get back into precrime. So, this is the future everyone lives in. Gradually being powered by a new energy source that is making things much more permanent, but also the most efficient they've ever been. And the entity that gained the most advantage and the most notoriety was none other than precrime, which not only would have these incredible history-defying oracles called precogs, but also all the literal power they needed to prove how efficient and revolutionary they can be. And yet, believe it or not, despite having all this power, and despite possessing the most unique individuals in the world, I personally believe none of this would have mattered. Despite being able to predict the future, and especially murders, which might sound like the key to a better tomorrow, it might be possible that, even without the existence of the minority reports, precrime as a whole would have been destined to fail. How? Well, if you want to find out, you'll have to join me at the next video on this series of the Worldbuilding review of Steven Spielberg's Minority Report, where we will explore all the possible ways precrime could have caused way more trouble than they realized. So stay tuned, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments down below if you can predict what will happen. Follow me on Instagram, join my Discord server, and if you want to help support this channel, join my Patreon, all three of which are linked down below. Thanks for listening, and until the next video, keep building worlds! And by the way, real quick, this video is sponsored by me. Cause yes, my book, Grimm, has now been released in 3 languages, English, Italian, and German, and are all available on Amazon right now. It's a dark horror fantasy suspense story about a teenager who has the strange ability to see none other than the Grim Reaper. And one day he has to strike a terrible deal with the Reaper in order to save someone he loves. The reviews so far have been surprisingly good, and I thank each and every one of you who had a chance to read it. If you're also interested in giving it a shot, feel free to click the links down in the description below, or use the QR codes you see right here on the screen for each language. Give it a read, and feel free to leave a review, or let me know your thoughts on this channel's Discord server, also linked below. Thank you for listening, and see you at the next video. Consequences of precrime. So, we discussed so far the differences between the book and the film, as well as what might be powering this entire future. Either way, the premise remains the same. It's a future where a police force called precrime has a way to predict crimes and murders before they happen, only to discover that there are case files called minority reports that show that the system is more flawed than one might think. A very original concept for sure, but this begs 2 questions. 1. Could there have been other ways in which precrime would have failed? And 2. What would have realistically happened if it had done everything right instead? Because no matter how you spin it, I have reason to believe that precrime would have been doomed to fail either way. So, in this part, we will be exploring all the possible futures that could have happened in this story. Starting with... what if it failed? So, the main reason precrime was dismantled is because Police Chief John Anderton ended up discovering the minority reports, files that explained how the precogs sometimes have disagreements, and so it is possible to falsely accuse someone of preemptive murder, thus making the entire system fallible. But there are other ways in which it could have failed anyway. First off, sedating the precogs like this is either completely wasted or a sign that they're being tampered with. Why? Because the precogs should be able to tell way more than just murders. For example, when Agatha was kidnapped by Anderton and was finally able to see the world outside of precrime's temple, she was ironically able to see way more, to the point of predicting all those people at the mall and use them to their advantage to get away from the other precrime cops. But wasn't their whole shtick that they could only see future murders because of...
There's nothing more destructive to the metaphysical fabric that binds us than the untimely murder of one human being by another.
Yeah, sure, whatever that. And yet she proves that she can see things that don't involve murder. In fact, even the short story does say that the precogs actually can see all kinds of crimes, including freaking tax evasion of all things. Oh boy. Hell, ignoring that, she can also see not only alternate futures, but also alternate pasts. When she went to Lara's home, Agatha could sense Sean's entire timeline if he had been alive, including when he was still around 10 years old.
He's 10 years old.
Meaning she could see a few years behind. And considering Sean was 6 when he was kidnapped, and precrime has existed for 6 years since then yes, technically she's seeing what Sean would have been doing like a couple of years prior to this moment. Am I being anal about this? Yes. But this does prove that she can see through all of time if given enough concentration. She was drugged into mentally living in the future all the time, and only in specific horrifying scenarios, to the point that she was shocked to be living in the now when Anderton first got her out of precrime.
Is it now?
Yes, this is all happening right now.
I'm tired of the future.
The precogs should have been able to tell way more if precrime had only cut them some slack. So, unless this was also part of Lamar's plan somehow. In the same way the film asks the question, is it right to throw someone in jail for a crime they didn't do yet? It should also ask, is it right to overwork someone for the safety of thousands, even at the cost of limiting potential benefits for millions? But okay, let's ignore that for now and say that they're willing to go for it anyway. Even then, there are still problems. For example, let's not forget, the precogs are still human and they can't live forever. They're just 3 individuals who have this special ability but are prone to aging, and eventually they would have died out anyway. The only way to counteract this is if they force them, especially Agatha, to reproduce, and even then it's not a guarantee that their offsprings would have had the same abilities anyway. If not that, then precrime would have been forced to actually create more Neroin addicts like Anne Lively, and wait and see if their offsprings would also have this gift. And that's assuming that they didn't die after the age of 12. They'd have to go through who knows how many hundreds or thousands of cases like this, and it means they'd be willing to do atrocious acts towards innocent children. Not saying that it is impossible for governments to do atrocious experiments, but it's certainly something to judge upon. And even then, they'd have to wait at least a decade just to see if their experiment was a success at all. Yeah, sorry, but there will be ethical dilemmas with this all the way down. Precrime should ideally be something that could work for the rest of human history, and yet was working on borrowed time all along. And as soon as the precogs would have died of old age, chaos would have ensued right after. But okay, hey, fine. These are some examples of what could happen if precrime failed. Let's assume instead that they take all these things into account, and precrime somehow is an actual success that could last forever, and could continue either locally or nationally as was Lamar's original plan. What happens then? Well, what if it succeeded? Yeah, I'm sorry guys, but even then, in the best case scenario, precrime wouldn't have worked. Even before going global, people would have still tried to commit murders on purpose. Why? Because corrupt people could just hire goons to commit murders in specific ways, and in turn, use the outcomes of those events to their advantages. The precogs are set up to only see murders anyway, not if someone also hired them, as was the case with John Anderton and Leo Crow. Like in the example I mentioned, a crime boss could send a goon to kill maybe one of their own wives, knowing precrime would stop them anyway, and in the process find out if they were cheating or something. Or, I don't know, they could plan a murder at a horse race, somehow put a mole in precrime just to see the outcomes of the horse race without any other ill intent, and win big time while letting their goon go to jail, knowing that precrime would have stopped them. There are loads of ways to exploit this system, and it really doesn't take much to become this world's equivalent of Light Yagami from Death Note. Then, precrime is at first an experiment just to see if they can foresee murders in the greater DC area, right? But if the plan is to go nationwide or even global, how could they achieve this if, so far, they only have 3 precogs? It's already quite a strain on them to have these visions, and they need to be constantly sedated. Even assuming that precrime somehow finds a way to amplify their power, all the murders of even the nation, much less the world, would be happening constantly in their brains and eventually kill them from the strain. And then precrime would cease to exist anyway unless they immediately find new precogs. Which, as mentioned before, even if they had a whole series lined up as replacements, they'd all be burned through very soon. But okay, let's think positive. Since the visions of precogs are supposedly clearest when they're close together, what if you managed to find or make even more precogs in the future, and work together like a computer with way more processing power than it should have? Sheer strength in numbers. They would see things more and more clearly and have far more control and clarity of their visions. Which, however, could mean that even the most powerful people in the world can't have any of their personal secrets revealed, creating an erasure of privacy. And I think they'd be far more inclined to either corrupt precrime from the start in their favor, so forget it being this paragon of justice, or, more likely, just get rid of precrime in general in order for their corruption to continue. This whole film is about crime and corruption after all, and considering that even the federal government has quote-unquote other plans for the precogs, one can only speculate on how many ways this can be done in the name of corruption and power. In other words,
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
in fact, on that note, since knowing your possible future is the only time in which you have a chance to alter it, it means officers of precrime would be the only ones who hold all the power, because they'd be the only ones who would know what the precogs see and have the power to alter the future as they please, depending on who they give the information to. Something that even the ending of the original short story has actually alluded to. So, unless all visions are trapped in a black box that not even the officers can see and only get crumbs of, they would be seen as the most dangerous force in the world and would be targeted by the most powerful people in the world, most likely for bad. Although, real quick, I do have to actually cut the story some slack for something. Assuming the Minority Reports were more commonly known, one could argue that maybe a possible solution could be to have a spur-of-the-moment murder vision and straight up go to the potential murderer and tell them what they're about to do, giving them a chance to actually stop beforehand. That way it's not precrime's full responsibility anymore. Well, that wouldn't work either. Because the moment you give the public information about an event that's going to happen in the future, depending on the details of that event, they could choose to just not do the murder, but still exploit other details like, I don't know, stocks in that moment or whatever if applied. In which case, like with my previous example, a regular person would know that precrime will stop them anyway, decide not to commit murder anymore, and then have the benefit of knowing extra stuff in advance. The system can always abuse the public, sure, but the public can also abuse the system. So, if I was precrime, I admit I'd also be tempted to absolutely give the public as little information as possible, or maybe not at all. But whatever, fine. Point to the movie. Anyway, finally, what would happen if precrime worked and actually went global? Well, it wouldn't work in that case either. Terrorists and dictatorship countries who want to cause genocides now wouldn't be able to, because they know that the precogs will immediately sense thousands of people dying all at once. Which, by the way, means precrime should take into account a way bigger VAT for those wooden balls. But then, on the flip side, if they're aware of this, then they do it on purpose anyway, just to overwhelm the precogs to death. Evil men in power could literally just get rid of the competition by fighting fire with gasoline on someone else's territory, and they'd use precrime's greatest asset against them. I'm sorry guys, but it just can't work. No matter how you spin it, realistically speaking, precrime is destined and doomed to fail, and in this case, they wouldn't be blessed with a choice. So, what does this all mean? Everything was pointless? Is the solution to just let crime go wild like it did before? Because it would only go harder now that criminals would have free reign, and for all its complications and Lamar's lies, at least there was a good base intent with the precrime program. Nah, come on, it can't just end there. There must be some way to counterbalance this. And not only do I think there is, but it's already been put in action and has been hiding in plain sight all along. But if you want to find out what that is, you'll have to join me next time at the final video on this series of the Worldbuilding review of Minority Report. So stay tuned, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, follow me on my Instagram, join my Discord server, as well as my Patreon, all linked down below, and I'll see you at the final stretch. Take care, and as always, keep building worlds! And also, remember to join my Patreon, where you can have the opportunity to actually have one-on-one sessions with me personally, where I can help you fix the world building and plot of your stories as well. Narrowin. So, we speculated on all the ways precrime wouldn't have worked, and even then, the film presents a very black and white way of seeing the outcomes of precrime. It works completely, or one small flaw makes the whole system fall down. And to be fair, the ethics that this story plays with are absolutely fascinating and well executed. However, while storytelling-wise it is very impactful, I think they could have also chosen a middle ground. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's take it from the top one more time.
Okay, let's do this one last time, yeah?
We said that this is a world where surveillance is absolutely everywhere, regardless if it was caused by a possible war as was described in the original short story by Philip K. Dick, or if the trajectory of our modern society is just inclined to naturally gravitate towards that direction. Frustrating as that might sound, especially nowadays. At the same time, the streets have been flooded with a drug called Narrowin, which many people got hooked on. Children born from addict parents started to show signs of brain damage, and also revealed to possess the ability to see murders happening in the future. Only 3 survived beyond the age of 12 and became the precogs, starting the entire precrime program, and the rest is history. However, have you ever stopped to consider something a little peculiar? The whole plot is technically set off by John Anderton being given a vision that he will murder Leo Crow, but none of the events of the downfall of precrime would have happened if it wasn't for one scene earlier in the film. After Witwer entered the temple by order of the federal government, something pretty much no one should be able to do, Anderton is left alone with the precogs for a couple of minutes, and it's only when they're alone that Agatha suddenly wakes up and gives Anderton a vision of what truly happened to her mother and Lively, which we later find out was one of the titular minority reports. Now, why would Agatha have this vision? Why would it happen now? Why would it be so intense as to wake her from her heavily sedated state? And why does she do this only to Anderton? Because without this scene, none of the events after this vision would have happened like this. It's like Agatha had been waiting for this very moment, but it couldn't have been. So what gives? Well, I think that all of this might have been a side effect of the Narrowin itself. If you recall, Dr. Eidman said to Anderton that Narrowin was what caused all of this, but that it was first an impure version of the drug, not like the quote-unquote
engineered cocktail that became so popular among the more educated.
This implies that Narrowin has been improved to the point that it completely stopped causing the risky side effects that would have created the precogs in the first place. Then, at the same time, during the film, we see that Anderton has been secretly and illegally taking another kind of drug called clarity.
Just need a little clarity. You want the customary clarity or the new and improved kind of clarity?
In order to cope with the loss of his son Sean. A drug that of course is illegal to have, and even Witwer tries to jail Anderton for. Now, to be clear, these are explained to be 2 completely separate drugs. I haven't found any particular link between the 2, so I won't claim that there is. However, narratively speaking, I propose that there should have been. So, from here on, this will be my personal theory on how to tie all of this together more properly. If these 2 separate drugs had actually been the same, or at least similar, with one of them improved, this could mean that even people like John Anderton could have been getting possible slight changes to their bodies, in the same way Narrowin caused the mutation for the precogs. Mind you, I'm not trying to say that this should give him and other addicts some kind of supernatural power. Not at all, he's still just a regular guy. However, what if this particular change was only to cause a very slight disruptive frequency to the collective mind of the precogs? And yes, I do mean collective, because as we said earlier, since the precogs together are able to see future murders, but Agatha has proven to be able to see across all of time if given a breather, perhaps their presence together might have actually been limiting their brains. With John's, however, it could have been just enough to make the most gifted of them, Agatha, tune out the others, even if just for a moment. Neurwin was the unrefined drug that gives these abilities individually, but at the cost of choking their full potential when together. Whereas Clarity, as the name implies, could have been the refined version that accidentally helped negate this collective disruption even while they're sedated. This would justify then why Agatha had suddenly jumped to him when they were alone, and only alone, to help him see the murder of her own mother. A plea for help that couldn't have been possible before, because Anderton was always on the other side of the glass and never close enough, because he's also not allowed in the temple, and even when he did enter, the presence of others was enough to tamper with his own neurological interference. Thus, it was only in this single occasion that something like this could happen against all odds. Now hold on, you're probably thinking that I'm being crazy here. Sure, the precogs are mutants, but they're like the one main exception here, right? After all, it's so rare that it's what jump-started all of this. But I personally think that there might be some evidence that John, and honestly other people in the world, are starting to have changes as well. And the key to that, believe it or not, is none other than Anderton's son, Sean. He was at a public pool having fun with his father, and all it took was a moment's distraction for Sean to fully disappear, making Anderton spiral into despair and obsession, get into precrime, get hooked on Clarity, and drive him to ensure that precrime had to work. And yes, it is sadly implied that whatever did specifically happen to Sean, he just didn't make it. But did you notice something weird about this? Sean got kidnapped and disappeared in a future where surveillance is almost everywhere. And yes, I get it that I proposed it might have some blind spots here and there, but look at this place. It's a damn public pool. Even assuming the culprit did just miraculously get away with all of these people around, why wouldn't there be eye scanners here as well? Sean is Anderson's son too, a cop. Someone who would have to spend his life looking around his back, because he could get jumped at any moment due to his profession, and he would need to ensure to be in a place where his own son would be safe when the option to do so is present. So how and why was no one able to find Sean anymore, especially when you have all of these goddamn eye scanners? Well, because I think something deeper is happening. What if, in the same way Neurwin has been causing side effects that lead to the precogs, other substances in the world, even unrefined ones, were also starting to have other side effects? Such as, for example, making sure that all the future generations like Sean wouldn't have eyes that have an eye signature anymore, and be among the first that won't be traced in the future. You might think that's ridiculous and that there's no reason to believe that, but it would make sense. This is a future where things are changing rapidly. Surveillance is everywhere. Crime had been on the rise. If we go by the original short story, it's possible that global wars could have been going on. New forms of energy, as I proposed before, would be making it very difficult to change things back anymore. People were so stressed and desperate that they were willing to replace or even gouge their freaking eyes out just to have some privacy. And on top of that, here you have a drug that literally caused mutations in children, to the point that a rare few gained an ability never before seen in the history of the human race. Well, answer me this. What do mutations do? They're a way to change and adapt when there is a particular change in your environment. Now, this happens very slowly across time and through generations. However, this is a future scenario in which humans have found a way to create a single drug that, even if accidentally, jump-started mutations to the point that some could see the future. So, since it was an unforeseen side effect anyways, What if other drugs, or hell, even just the refined versions of the original Neuroin, were still speedrunning changes in humans and their offsprings this whole time? Except, since they were improved, the changes weren't as drastic. The first doses caused a mutation that was so great and fast that very few kids survived it, but those who did got an ability that went overboard and leaped way beyond what the environment required, and it made them become the most important people on the planet. The others would have had other mutations too, but not lethal, much more subtle and in tune to their environment, such as making their eyes not be traced by exaggerated scanners anymore, or even more subtly, creating a passive counter to the 3 times evolution did overstep. Not to mention that these subtler changes are significant enough that they couldn't have happened on their own anyway, unless they had been done so artificially. Plus, hey, if freaking planets are becoming so mutated that they're moving like tentacles now, I don't see why this can't be the case. And yes, this does mean that everyone in the world would be aware that something is happening to the human race as a whole, and Anderton would have been aware that Sean was more at risk of disappearing. But then again, since the precogs were taking all the spotlight anyway, perhaps with some cases, religiousness would have been a bit more on the rise as a way to cope with dealing with a great change everyone was seeing coming from the horizon, so they wouldn't be focusing on the actual task at hand.
Everything's going to change now, isn't it?
And having said all of that, if you still don't think that this feels right, I would argue that it would not only add to the complexity of the film, but be in tune with its theme. Minority Report is a story all about the ethics of mass surveillance and morality, both in space as well as in time. But more specifically, it's also an exploration of the consequences of what happens when you go too far. Surveillance is too widespread even in the name of security, so people become desperate and overwhelmed. Drug addicts need to cope, and take something that causes what could have easily been seen as an aberration, like the precogs. The precogs could have been able to tell so much more, but are kept in an imprisoned environment that chokes them and causes too much trauma. A police force the likes of which had never been seen before is created to test the idea of finally stopping all crime in the world, yet does so with so much devotion and such an iron grip that if one single flaw were to ever be discovered, the entire system would collapse and cause more harm later than there ever had been before. That same police force had paradoxically created a new kind of religious devotion in this futuristic world that, when it would inevitably collapse, would frankly cause even more turmoil when the trust of all its new faithful followers would be broken. And even at the more personal character levels, those who became too obsessed with something would be the ones to suffer the most in the end, and just like nature, will have to adapt or die. This is a cautionary tale of what happens when we, as individuals and as a society, find a brand new shiny thing and forget to exercise caution. And yet, if it had followed the path that I just laid out, it could have simultaneously proven that the world doesn't have to be as black and white. If precrime hadn't been so strict on its infallible image, it could have at least tried to continue on by perhaps not imprisoning spur-of-the-moment murderers, and instead give them at least a chance to parley. If they hadn't kept such an iron grip on the precogs and also given them a slightly better life, they could have maybe seen far more than just the futures of only murders. Plus, criminals don't have to know when the precogs are working, so the fear of being caught would have been more than enough. If the drug addicts had controlled themselves a bit more, they wouldn't have birthed damaged children who would have been imprisoned or, more likely, died a horrible premature death. If the world's surveillance had relinquished a little more, there wouldn't have been a need for this drug to come into existence. And again, if this world hadn't been tightening its grip like the chord of a guitar, its future generations wouldn't have had a need to counter by evolving traits to elude that very same mass surveillance. Even freaking nature might be trying to say this, man. The true answer, as the characters prove themselves in their arcs, is to break free of this rigidity and allow yourself some slight messiness. Because like all great stories, if you want a better future, you learn to move on or you die with your cause, regardless of which one it may be. If nothing else, the only single silver lining in all of this, which people can latch onto, is the notion that, despite living in a world where both space and time are constantly watching you, there is always one thing that even the most supernatural of beings can take away from you. And that is the power to choose. And that, folks, was the world-building review of Steven Spielberg's Minority Report. Oh boy, I didn't expect I'd have this much to say about it. It's definitely one of those stories that packs several punches in a single runtime, and manages to leave you with all sorts of juicy questions about destiny, morality, justice, and more to chew on. Not to mention that it's also loaded with awesome action sequences and sci-fi concepts. Sure, maybe it could have fine-tuned some of the lore and logic of this world a little bit more, especially with how the precogs work, but then again, it still does a surprisingly good job, especially for its time, and especially when it had to do so in only one film. Extended projects notwithstanding. Whenever I think of high sci-fi concepts, Minority Report is easily one of the first ones that come to mind, and easily deserves all the respect that it got, both for the ideas proposed in Philip K. Dick's original short story, as well as the awesome execution of the Holy Emperor of cinema himself. And while even I have to sadly agree that this was the last truly historical, impactful film that Spielberg made so far, not that the other ones weren't good, but still, if there ever has to be one that represents the height of what he can do in the later stages of his career, this is definitely one that deserves to be seen and foreseen for all the rest of time. Anyway, that's all for today, folks. What do you think? Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I talking out of my ass? Maybe. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to click the bell for further notifications. Please subscribe to my Patreon to help support what I do here. It would be very much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on my Instagram page, as well as joining my Discord server for further discussions, and to also find out what the future videos might be about. The links to all of these, of course, are down below. And if there's any other franchise whose world building you'd like analyzed, let me know. Until next time, keep building worlds!